Okay, well, enough of that nonsense, you guys. Los Angeles Birders is very pleased to have Jon Dunn as our presenter tonight. As many of you know, Jon is a leading expert on the identification and distribution of North American birds and is well known for his work on all the editions of the National Geographic Society's Field Guides to Birds of North America, and as the co-writer and host of Large and Small Gulls of North America, and as co-author with Kimball Garrett of Birds of Southern California, Status and Distribution, and the Peterson Field Guides to Warblers. In 2012, Jon was a recipient of the ABA's Roger Tory Peterson Award, given for a lifetime of achievements in promoting the cause of birding. But Jon also has other interests outside of birds, including politics, history, cinema, and of course the poetry and music of Leonard Cohen. And so without further ado, we'll turn the program over to Jon, and thank you, Jon, so much.
Welcome, friends.
And I'm sorry, Jon, I think we wanted to give a shout out at this point to some of the photos in your presentation before the presentation starts, to Larry Sansoni. Thank you very much, Larry.
Any other quick announcements? Otherwise, I'll interject and welcome everybody. I'm generally a passerine person. Most of my loves go to the latter half of the field guide, but my very favorite family is shorebirds, and really always has been. And one of the perplexing groups within that group are the Dowitchers. Here Larry has a picture of a number of Dowitchers in flight with some smaller calidris and a nice happy mass of shorebirds, that the sort of thing that we relish during migration. And of course, August is a month. It's a little early for major passerine migration, but the juvenile shorebirds are here. Some of the adults are still here when migrating, others wintering. It is the month to be looking at the mudflats. There are also lots of ducks, but they're all fairly boring looking. So we turn our attention to we call them shorebirds. In Europe, they call them waders, or at least those that speak English. These things are a collective effort. I'll be babbling for an hour or longer, but virtually all the slides are Larry's. We didn't identify them all. A few of mine, I have JLD there, but Larry's been a workhorse with the white crowns and now with these Dowitchers from all of his photography up in Ventura County. So we'll just get started here. We won't talk about the birds in this image. It's kind of a title picture. Next. And then we get down to the nitty gritty. The genus Limnodromus was described by Weed in 1833 and is comprised of 3 species. The 2 we know well, short-billed and long-billed dowitcher. And then if you're in Asia, China in migration, or Thailand, or Indonesia, there's this very large dowitcher called the Asian or the Asiatic dowitcher. The change of the genus, and I don't know all the intricate workings, was changed from Macroramphus to Limnodromus with the 17th supplement of the AOU checklist in 1920. The genus definition means marsh runner. And the origin of Dowitcher is perhaps from German or Dutch, and many of the folks that hunted them in Long Island were of that ancestry. But Wikipedia said it came from an Iroquois word. Now, undoubtedly, the Dutch intermixed, of course, with the Iroquois as well as other tribes. I mean, what did they buy? Manhattan for a very low price. So whatever it's derived from, there we have it, Iroquois or Dutch or German. Asian Dowitchers known only from Asia. unrecorded for North America, and I think from Europe as well. But it could occur in Alaska or elsewhere. It breeds not in the Russian Far East, but Siberia, highly migratory. And that's the bird on the top there in the winter in Thailand. It's an extremely long bill. It's the longest billed of the dowitchers and also the biggest. Next slide. Let's have a call out. All of these things was a development of history. We use the accomplishments of one as a building block. Dowitchers were considered one species up until 1950. And then Rowan, in describing a new subspecies of short-billed dowitcher, Hendersoni, in 1932, suspected very strongly that there were indeed two species of dowitcher, which Pitelka then got into the act in the 40s, and with the help of Rollo Beck, who collected several thousand specimens of dowitchers, looked at specimens from across North America and described them as two species, that there were two species, and described a West Coast additional subspecies of short-billed dowitcher, and wrote all of that up in 1950 in a big monograph. So there's a picture of Frank. Frank also, it was really his groundbreaking work on within the Western scrub jays. He analyzed the whole genus, why we have woodhouses and California scrub jays as separate species. A man who dabbled in many things, did them all very thoroughly and competently. The recent analysis genetically shows a deep division within short-billed and long-billed dowitcher. Aves and Zink estimate they diverged some 4 million years ago. And you listen to the call notes, and they're very different from each other, and yet alone the song, that little song type, is quite similar, which I find is an interesting footnote. In any case, they were split as two species in the 5th edition of the AOU checklist, based on Pitelka's publication. So here's the one we'll dispense with. It's a great bird to see. Look for it in Thailand. It's a very big bird, almost more reminiscent of a bar-tailed godwit than one of our dowitchers. When I was in Thailand this last year, we were desperately looking for Asian dowitcher, which is always one of the big three, along with Nordman's greenshank and the spoon-billed sandpiper, of course. And I finally did find a dowitcher. It was asleep, but I recognized it and photographed a long-billed dowitcher, which is not what the folks had come to see, but very rare in Thailand. Next slide. Again, with the long bill. It lacks the white stripe up the back, which is characteristic of R2 dowitchers. Very large dowitcher. Okay, now we're going to get to short-billed dowitcher. And it's confusing. In fact, it confused all the professionals for 100 or more years as to what was going on. Short-billed has 3 distinct subspecies, which we need to learn about because the last described by Pitelka, caurinus, are short-billed dowitchers, highly variable, and can show characters of either of the 2 eastern subspecies, which are pictured above and which we'll discuss. Clinally, they go from the smallest in the east, griseus, to the largest on the west coast, caurinus. All 3 species breed in these forested sedge sphagnum bogs between 50 and 55 degrees north latitude. Winter strictly in large coastal estuaries. Gell, in his the BNA account for short-billed dowitcher, discusses how hard the nest is to find. And the eastern subspecies, griseus, the nest wasn't found until 1977 in Labrador, despite decades of searching for it, all in the same location. So they knew they were there, but they couldn't confirm nesting. Next slide. So let's take a look here. We'll start and go from east to west and start with the nominate subspecies, which Meelan described in 1789 from Long Island, where it would have been a migrant. And you'll see, we know our geography. East of Hudson Bay, there's this hunk of reddish, which is Labrador, and that's where griseus breeds. And they migrate primarily along the Atlantic coast, with some to about Lake Erie, Lake Huron, as far west as that. They typically migrate up the Atlantic coast a little later than the next subspecies, Hendersoni, in the spring, and a little earlier in the fall, which I find interesting. Short-billed dowitcher of any sort, presumably griseus or Hendersoni, is accidental in Western Europe. Griseus, typified, as we can see in the top two illustrations, by a large white belly and heavily barred sides and flanks. This is from the groundbreaking article by Jaramillo, Pittaway, and Burke, Birders' Journal, discussed from an Ontario perspective. When you get over to Hudson Bay, particularly James Bay, you have some breeding griseus in eastern James Bay, and then you pick up the next subspecies, Hendersoni, somewhere along Hudson Bay, plus intergrades, and the bottom two figures are intergrades towards the next subspecies, Hendersoni. But strong barring on the flanks, not super colorful above, and a large white belly patch is characteristic of the nominate subspecies of short-billed dowitcher. Next. So here's our next subspecies, Hendersoni, described by Rowan in 1932, who had also cottoned on to the fact that there were almost certainly two species of dowitchers. So it breeds in the probably the Peace River parklands of northeastern British Columbia, northern Alberta, northern Saskatchewan, over to the shores of Hudson Bay, to at least Churchill, and then integrates with griseus from those intermediate figures over towards the west side of Hudson Bay. First nest found in 1906, and winters in the mid-Atlantic states and the Gulf, Mexico, right along the coast, south to South America. In the spring, they migrate up the East Coast till about New Jersey, a few up to New England, and then they cut inland. You can see where they breed. So they're a frequent bird in the Great Lakes. Some also migrate up through the Midwest, up to about the Central Great Plains. And you can see that pink area or pinky red or vermilion color in north central Canada where they breed. So this is the central subspecies, and it's a little larger than griseus, but smaller than caurinus to the west. Next slide. And that leaves caurinus, our short-billed dowitcher. Now, it's the subspecies that Pitelka described in 1950. It breeds primarily in south coastal Alaska and winters from basically the Bay Area, a few in Humboldt Bay, also Morro Bay. That basically winters only in the large coastal estuaries. So San Francisco Bay, Morro Bay, Upper Newport Bay, San Diego Bay. Elsewhere along the coast, like coastal Santa Barbara County, short-bill's very rare in the winter and migrates down to as far as northwestern South America. It migrates east to about the Western Great Basin. Now there's a couple of spots of color there, one in the southern Yukon, which is over the mountains, and it could be perhaps, there may be a very small breeding population along the Denali Highway. Those are interior posts, And one wonders if there are no specimens. The Yukon does not have a specimen of a breeding bird. They breed at Swan Lake and Lake Labarge. Could they be western extensions of Hendersoni as opposed to caurinus? It's an interesting question. If you're getting bored, I put in a line here. Was that night on the marge of Lake Labarge, I cremated Sam McGee, from the cremation of Sam McGee by Robert Service, known as the Bard of the Yukon, that he wrote in 1907. I doubt if Sam McGee or Robert Service was concerned about the subspecies of Dowitcher that bred at Lake Labarge, but nevertheless, it's an interesting footnote. Next slide. So here's Pitelka's type description of the newly described subspecies. Compared to Hendersoni, which again had been described in 1932, caurinus is more heavily and densely spotted and more white ventrally. Again, that suggests like griseus, the eastern one, and is more varied in the ventral coloration, since the color of variants of the Hendersoni type occur in caurinus. It was intermediate in ground color, but closer to griseus in the markings on the underparts. So in other words, to really confuse everybody, caurinus can look like Hendersoni or more likely griseus from farther east. It's a very, in the alternate plumage. The other plumages are thankfully, the juvenile and basic or winter plumage are alike in all the subspecies, but in the breeding plumage, it shows the distinct differences. It would be a happy family if there was just Hendersoni and griseus, and then you throw in caurinus that can look like either type. And if some of you decide you've heard enough of Dowitchers, I don't blame you, but we have lots of pictures that'll hopefully keep you clued up, or maybe go get yourself a drink and you'll feel better. Next slide. So here's caurinus. Here's a fairly typical bird. Fairly colorful above, without white tips above, but again, they're variable. They show the breeding range. They migrate north along the Pacific coast, but also inland in California and the westernmost Great Basin. The spring migration is a month earlier than two eastern subspecies, primarily in a fairly narrow time frame from the end of the first week into late April, probably peaking by the 23rd. They move in a sudden mass. Hendersoni doesn't appear till usually in the Midwest till after the 10th of May, and griseus not till after the 15th of May from migration spots. Adults are back south in early July, and the migration continues on to mid-August. Juveniles have arrived about a week ago. I think the first one was on the 1st. And that migration continues through September with a few into early October. I once had a very late bird in the Antelope Valley, which I cite later, in late October at a small pond. It occurs north of its breeding range in Alaska, casually on the Seward Peninsula and to the Pribilof Islands in the Bering Sea, but the species is unrecorded for Asia. Okay. Now, I put in some things about short-billed dowitcher, all subspecies, and stuff about behavior, structural things. They all the dowitchers, as well as stilt sandpipers, and for that matter, western sandpipers, have that sewing machine drilling, which if you know dowitchers at all, you'll know what we're talking about here. No real difference in feeding behavior of any of the three dowitchers. Short bills structurally are a little shorter legged and on average have a shorter bill, but the main useful thing is that there's strong sexual dimorphism in long-billed on bill length. So a female long-billed, it'll hit you as a very long bill. If the bill is short, appears short, it doesn't tell you a whole lot. There are maybe some primary extension differences, which I haven't carefully figured out. To me, short-bill's a little smaller, reminds me of a little more of a red knot in shape, a little rounder perhaps. And short-billed feeds in shallower water, often along shores, and long-billed feeds in deeper water. Obviously, there's overlap and they mix. One last thing on this. I am not a jizz birder. I mean, I always get an impression, but if you go on, there's a lot of popular stuff out there. One is, it looks like long-billed Dowitcher swallowed a tennis ball and all of this. I think if you rely on these subtle shape things, you are headed down the road to trouble. It's sort of like going to a big party now without a mask. Bad results could happen and you will need to be hospitalized for Dowitcher syndrome. There's a question, do they vocalize while eating? True in long-billed, less so in short-billed, and we'll get to that. So here's long-billed. It was described by Thomas Say, who was on Audubon's Missouri River expedition. Say's Phoebe, the type location Council Bluffs, Iowa, 1823, treated as a subspecies of short-billed Dowitcher until the 5th edition, as we talked about earlier. I love Hoffman's Birds of the Pacific States, and he talks about their calls as a throaty kikeri. So he was on to the calls. Bless Hoffman, he really knew what he was doing. And there's the longbill. We'll talk about its appearance a little later. That's a worn adult, late July. Next slide. So here's the long-billed breeding. It breeds to the north of short-bill. There's a very small overlap, perhaps, in southwest Alaska. Breeds on the north slope, east to Mackenzie, Northwest Territory. And you'll see the Chukotka Peninsula of the Russian Far East there. But it extends its breeding range all the way west to include Wrangell, around Wrangell Island, and west to the Timor Peninsula, which is some 2,500 miles or more from Nome. So it has an immense part of its breeding range is in the Russian Far East. Most of those birds come back to North America to winter, but it's, along with pectoral sandpiper, one of the most numerous North American shorebirds in the Western Palearctic, and is recorded in most parts of the world. Next slide. Migrates in numbers throughout the West and the Great Plains. It's much more local and scarce in the East. It's interesting, the spring migration, places where they don't winter, like here in the Owens Valley, for the most part, it starts earlier in the spring and extends later in the spring than the short bills. So we have long bills moving by the first week of March, and we have long bills still moving in mid-May, where the short bills, say from the 10th to the 28th of April, or would be a more typical date span. The fall migration, the adults, and we'll discuss this a little later, they arrive by mid-July. Juveniles are very interesting in that they don't arrive California until September, usually after Labor Day. I've seen, I think, 3 in August, 3 juveniles. And we'll get to that, but that means any juvenile Dowitcher you see for the first 3.5 weeks of August will be a short-billed Dowitcher. It's one of the rules you need to learn, and we'll keep emphasizing that. Next slide. So we explain again, compare to pectoral sandpiper, which is why it occurs so often in Europe. The Timor Peninsula is at the Yenisei River's on the east side, but that's that big bulge in Arctic Russia that points north and is very influential for this separation of birds from Europe to the west and Asia to the east. Next slide. So I wanted to get into this business on, we're going to get into plumages. But when we get into that, as boring as it is, you just have to learn feather topography. We tell the juveniles apart. You really need to know what you're doing. And there's really no excuse for not learning what you're doing other than a valid complaint that it's boring. But then don't do dowitchers. And we identify the basic feather groups here. The scapulars, I identify the smaller inner ones, inner scapulars or upper scapulars, and the lower ones or outer scapulars or larger feathers. Got multiple rows of lesser coverts, but just one row of medians, and the large greater secondary coverts, and then just a little bit of the primary tips show. And then the three tertials, the middle one's usually a little longer. And the key in these juvenile dowitchers, and we'll blow these up, the inner greater secondary coverts and the tertials. You need to find those half dozen feathers, know where they are. The tertials are not the primaries. Primaries, you just have a few millimeters of a black stub sticking out. Tertials are saber-shaped and long. The inner greater secondary coverts are a little fatter and easier to see the pattern. On those juveniles, you've got to learn those cold and beyond cold. Typical of a juvenile longbill, and we'll look at some pictures later, often when they first appear in September, they're already molting, as this bird is. Next slide. So we'll start with the juvenile short-billed dowitcher. Now these birds appear in around the 1st of August and are already in good numbers now. They probably peak anywhere from the middle of the month to Labor Day. This is not the peak of short-billed dowitcher, it's the peak of juvenile short-bills. The adults are already through, except where they're going to winter, like Upper Newport Bay. So you're going to find longbills in breeding plumage or molting to winter plumage and worn. And then you're going to see one of these fresh, bright, pristine birds with everything is fresh with a colored edge and the characters you can seize on. So we'll blow those coverts up in a minute. On average, and particularly in Hendersoni, the tail of short-billed is paler than long-billed, but you need to identify what the tail is. The sides of the breast are always an important feature in all plumages and dowitchers to look at. They're a little more spotted than short-billed here in juvenile plumage. Typically, they're brighter than juvenile longbill. Next slide. So let's blow it up here. You can see the primary tip, just a few millimeters of blackness extending out past the tertials. And within the tertials, you'll see a colored edge, but a loop on the inside of that, where about that arrow points to tertials, parallels the edge of the feather. There's not 6 feathers there, there's 3. And the 3 visible ones all have an internal colored line or part of a loop. And you can see the same sort of thing on the greater secondary coverts. Those features are utterly diagnostic of a shortbill. Notice on the inner greater secondary coverts, they're a little broader, more like your thumb maybe, if the tip of your thumb is deformed, but nevertheless. So it's broader and easier to see the internal markings, and just as easy to see as the tertials. Most people confuse, despite constant prodding, you need to remember that the tertials, even though they may look like the primaries, they're not. The primaries are virtually completely hidden by the tertials. Next slide. So here, on longbill, and we'll blow that up to the longbill, the tertial pattern just has an edge with no strong internal markings. I need to also say on juvenile shortbill, the pattern can be internal loops or diagonal stripes that cut across the feather, tiger stripes. So the pattern is variable. The point is there are always internal colored marks on short-bill. Next slide. So here's the long-billed. Notice the date, 17 September. It's a juvenile bird, but it's already molted scapulars. A number of the scapulars were already first basic, which is typical. They stay a little longer up on the breeding grounds and are often already molt or molting. And longbill, it's a molt migrant in the sense that, as we'll discuss, that the juveniles are molting during migration and the adults will go places in July and start molting, which shortbills do not. Now, look here at the tertials. They're plain with a slight colored edge, and the three visible inner greater secondary coverts are plain without internal markings, which tells you right away. And another nice thing, on the juveniles, those tertials and inner greater secondary coverts are molted late. So even in January, I can still identify a first winter dowitcher if I can find telltale juvenile feathers in the tertials and the inner greater secondary coverts. Next slide. So here we have the nice bright short-billed on the 11th of August, and Larry's shot of an atypically bright long-billed dowitcher, the left of those two birds on the right. And at first glance, they look essentially identical, but you then got to go right to the pattern of the tertials and the inner greater secondary coverts. And we'll look at the next slide. So there you are. And you'll notice the tertials and those inner greater secondary coverts don't show the internal marks. That long bill has some spotting on the sides of the breast. And first appearance, it looks nice and bright. And I'd say, oh, good, we have a short-billed dow, but it fails. Next slide. Back to the long-billed. Now get a sense how a little bit of the primaries show, just the little tip. You see the tertials, you see the three inner greater secondary coverts. And this is true for all shorebirds. And I think the next slide we have the wings stretched. So it gives you a sense. You can see the primaries and primary coverts there. All of that's hidden on the folded wing. And there are the scapulars that we were pointing to. And the tertials, while they're so dramatic on the folded wing, as the wing spreads out, you barely notice them. Same with the inner greater secondary coverts. There's one other, and the secondaries are all hidden as well. There's one other thing about dowitcher, telling dowitcher tales. There's less difference, if any difference, with the upper tail coverts. You've got to see the actual tail. And I've had the arrow here points to the separation of the longest upper tail coverts from the actual tail. Now here you can see the tail has broad dark bars, typical of a longbill. But if you're looking at a bird flying, how do you know what you're seeing, separating between the base of the tail and those long upper tail coverts? So you need to know exactly what you're looking for, and tail pattern is at best a secondary field mark. If you can see the arrow, it's pointed to about the junction of the longest upper tail coverts where they overhang the tail. Next slide. So that's a good shot of the tail. You can be sure what you're seeing, the upper tail coverts versus the actual tail. On the long billed, the tail's fully spread. On the short bill, on the right, I'm not exactly sure where the upper tail coverts end and the tail begins, whether I'm seeing anything informative. Next slide. And here is a group of short bills in flight with a bit of imagination. And after a gender tonic or two, you might notice the paler tail on a few of those short bills. Sorry, I don't have better shots, but the way it goes. Next slide. All right. Now we've covered juvenile plumage. That's the easy plumage. Once you get those tertials and integrator secondary covered, so if you get a good view of the bird, it's straightforward what species you have. The breeding plumage is more subtle and difficult between the two. And then the basic or winter plumage is harder still. I won't say almost impossible, but it's approaching that level. In fresh alternate plumage, long-billed is richly chestnut, cinnamon chestnut underneath, appears quite dark. The chestnut's a dark chestnut color in the feathers on the upper parts, and the scapulars are tipped white in contrast, a very distinctive appearance, which is diagnostic. Next slide. So here are a couple of long bills, and you can see also kind of the barred appearance to the sides of the neck. It's subtle, a little less spotted than short bill. The close bird has a pretty long bill. It could easily be a female. The long-billed dowitcher to me often appears a little paler crowned in breeding plumage than short bill. And rich dark chestnut, you can kind of see the white tipping above and the very dark ground color to the upper parts with dark chestnut in there. Next slide. So here's one of Peter Burke's illustrations. Now, if you remember on the East Coast, if you see a white belly on a breeding plumage dowitcher, you have a short-billed dowitcher. But the bottom birds are Hendersoni, and they don't have the white belly. It's all colored underneath and less marked below. So people would see those on the Atlantic coast, north to New Jersey or Long Island, and also see them in the Midwest where they migrate, and they had thought, oh, we have long-billed dowitchers, which are rare. Now in breeding plumage, and we'll get into this, you look for those white tips on the long bill, on the scapulars, and bars on the neck. But in worn breeding plumage, when they come back in July, those bars are gone for the most part on the sides of the neck, and the white tips have worn off. The two short bills show some variation in breast spotting, again of Hendersoni. Next slide. And that's back to our, just to compare again to griseus and the intergrades. And remember, caurinus can show any of these characters. Next slide. So just reviewing here in fresh alternate plumage, we've noted short bill is variable. You do want to look at the sides of the breast, more spotted and short-billed, not as barred. White belly that's in full breeding plumage is an indication of not a long-billed dowitcher. It's more colored than long-billed. So long-billed tends to be more colored like Hendersoni below in the extent of color. The color is a darker chestnut, but the upper parts are quite different. They're much brighter, more buffy gold on short bill. Next slide. So there's our typical griseus, the upper left, our typical Hendersoni, much brighter above, more colored underneath, top, middle, and then the variable appearance of caurinus at the bottom. Most tend to be a little more griseus-like. Some are Hendersoni like the one in the middle. Some are even a deeper, richer chestnut above. Or below, sorry. Almost curly sandpiper color. Next slide. So here's a flock a group of us had at Owens Lake this spring. These are all short-billed dowitchers. 18 April, right in the peak migration period for the species here in the Owens Valley. And just show how variable this flock was. They're pretty much all in breeding plumage, or most of the way there, maybe the one on the right. Just how variable the coloration is. But none of them with the dark coloration with obvious bold white tips, like long-billed. And we did get them calling. They were quiet for a very long time till they flew. And they flew on their own volition, as I recall. We were kind and gentle. Next slide. So a couple of them are very richly colored. Others have a lot of white on the belly. Next. So here's back to our caurinus on the left, and compare with a breeding plumage long-billed on the right. Look how those white tips stand out in the darker ground color. Next. So what do you do when you're looking at breeding plumage birds and you have two species involved? Other than once you get over the initial panic and take a sedative and start looking at them analytically, what do you see? Other than some sleeping dowitchers, a few that are awake. Next slide. So there's one short-billed in this group of long-bills. I was with a small group, and it was a late cold front, so these birds weren't moving anywhere, and we just basically walked right up to them at Crowley Lake. Next slide. And there's the short-bill. So we have a few more, and we'll discuss why. Next. So the short-bill is in the center. You might notice, especially the one to the left, the darker ground color to the upper parts. And in addition to the darker ground color, more blackish, the chestnut's not that golden buff. And then the white tips on the scapulars show very prominently. Maybe the cap's a little paler. So in short-bill, the supercilium's a bit more distinct. Good luck figuring shape differences out. Short-bills, again, though, do look a little smaller. Even though that bird in the low right is out of focus, you can see the white tips there on the scapulars. Next slide. There are short-bill Waldos in the upper left. Compare the color, especially the bird to the right of the long-bill. Next. Here's our centered caurinus short-bill. Next. Now here's that short-bill cropped. And perhaps you can see all the spots, the round spots on the sides of the breast. Colored underneath, no white tips on the scapulars. Next slide. So just when we think we have it figured out, the adults come south. Adults in most shorebirds come south first. The short-bills are coming south by the first week of July, the long-bills by after the 10th of July, a few earlier. And they come south in kind of this worn breeding plumage. And a lot of the bars on the sides of the neck have worn off. The white tips are all gone from the tips of the scapulars. It's all kind of unfair, but it's the way it is. And there's something important that Claudia Wilds and Mike Newland published on in their really groundbreaking 1983 birding article, that on the underparts, the markings on the long-billed on the sides of the breast or near the tip of the feather, so they wear away easily. It gives you cinnamon buff underparts. Whereas on short-bill, they're a little farther up the feather, so even though the tip wears away, the round dark spots remain. So we don't have shots of many we don't have shots of short-bills in July to show how they wear and faded, but the pattern of spotting still remains underneath on the sides of across the breast. And longbill, as you go out and look at them right now, some are really bright and some are already pretty dull. And that's typical all through this month and really much of September, even to October. You can get full breeding plumage birds that are very colorful. And by October, of course, almost all of them are in winter plumage, except for the juveniles. Next image. So here's a worn full breeding plumage longbill in late July, worn off the pale tips on the scapulars, and a typical appearance of longbills in September. Some are colorful or show some color, others are in full winter plumage. Next image. I'm going to keep showing this shot of Larry's. Going to be as close as, this is important for several things. That's probably a worn adult short-billed caurinus there that chose to summer. You can see all that spotting, the round spotting across the breast. Still some color above. The other four birds look essentially like winter plumage short-bills. The reality is they're a year old, and with short-bills, unlike longbills, they don't get into a full alternate plumage when they're 1 year old, and often spend the summer months where they wintered, like San Diego Bay, Upper Newport Bay. There's a few even in early June in this plumage from the Salton Sea, but you can see how heavily spotted they are, which is the best character to look at on winter plumage birds and telling the two are basic plumage, though the spots aren't as prominent as that usually. Next slide. Here are three longbills in basic plumage, the most difficult plumage to tell. Now, what I notice on many longbills, they show a solid slaty gray, almost tattler-like appearance across the breast. Look at that left bird, with no internal spotting effect. And that's something I, in general, look for: dark gray sides and flanks. At least on the left bird, the wings, depending on the wing posture. But in winter, it's a tough deal, and you just, if you think you have a short bill, stay with it and see if you can get it to call. Of course, some of the areas like Upper Newport Bay or San Diego Bay, on the tidal flats there, they're all short bills in the winter. Next image. Back to our Larry's favorite shot we'll be using of the short bills. Just sort of compare the four dull ones there. Next. The best way to tell them in the winter is to know where you are. And hopefully you'll be able to do that. And also to be able to know what date it is. And I know in a pandemic, the days all blend into each other. But if you're during the winter period, basically any time after mid-October until March, so mid-October through February, if you see a Dowitcher inland, it's a longbill. If you see a Dowitcher on the coast, but it's not at one of the big lagoons, it's a longbill. If you're at San Diego Bay or Morro Bay, I see Curtis's note. I just looked at his manuscript. It has lots of short bills too, as does San Francisco Bay. Rob Fowler says just a few at Humboldt Bay. And I noticed there are no winter records for Washington or Oregon of short-billed Dowitcher. and they have some pretty big bays. At least there weren't as of when those books were written. Onwards. So this is a long-billed molting. Dowitchers and molt. If you're in an area where short bills don't winter, any molting dowitcher should immediately tip the odds greatly in favor of long-billed dowitcher. And this long bill, it's not quite blown up enough, but it still has its juvenile tertials and integrator secondary coverts. And that works pretty much all through the fall and even into winter on some. The adults, if you go out and look where adults are now, the LA River adult longbills, or other places where the flocks are, they'll spend perhaps 2 months and go through a complete molt. Some of those places can be way north, like Montana, northeast Montana. There was one on Lake Erie, a good marsh there. Place that's safe, and they'll molt flight feathers, not all at once, of course. But when they fly, you'll see the big holes, missing primaries, secondaries. That's, if you're not in a place where short bill winters, that's an immediate indication or diagnostic that you have a long billed. And again, the juveniles, even when they first arrive of long bills, they're often molting. Short bills, when they arrive, they're in full pristine juvenile plumage. Next. So they don't, short bills typically don't molt during migration. I've had a few molting birds, place like Point Pinos, where they will not winter, but I reckon it's not that far from the Bay Area. They basically push on to the winter grounds, both the adults and the juveniles, and then molt. So that's a group of short-billed juveniles. Next. So we cropped one of those images. That short bill is in molt. It's Ventura. You can see the diagnostic integrator secondary coverts and the tertials with the internal loops. But you can also see some gray scapular feathers. Now, I don't know the winter status of short bill at Point Magoo. I haven't been there enough. It's a pretty big estuary. But there could well be some there. They wouldn't winter in the gun clubs there, but they could be on the tidal marsh. In any case, this guy is molting. I've never seen, of course this will be, I'll see one this year at Owens Lake, but I've never seen a juvenile short-billed in molt here in the interior. Next slide. So here again is about the repeating of the times. You need to know where you are, you need to know the date, and then you got to just simply memorize some rules. The adult short bills arrive in early July. Migration continues to the last of them by around the middle of August. Then the juveniles arrive around the 1st of August, the end of the first week of August, and then peak towards the middle end of the month into early September and trail into mid-October. So if you're in, this tells you for the place where short bill doesn't winter and you're in October, especially after the first week of October, you almost certainly have a long-billed dowitcher. If you have a juvenile dowitcher in August, especially if it's not the last 3 or 4 days, it's almost certainly a short-billed dowitcher. And on we go. Remember what I told you about winter. If you're anywhere away from the big estuaries, you have a long-billed. I have seen 3 juvenile long-billed dowitchers in the last week of August in Southern California. But I've seen that number also in 3 or 4 with far fewer birding days in Idaho and Montana. So it's possible a few longbills regularly get in the last third of August up near the Canadian border. Keep in mind, they're much more numerous in the west than the east. Next slide. We're down to calls. A few general rules. Short bills typically are silent when they feed. Long bills can't keep their mouth shut. They're often, as Hoffman says, given their keekery while feeding. You'll hear the keeks. They're kind of, don't get confused, black-necked stilts kind of have a keekery type note too. When they fly, and in short bills, that's when you typically hear the call. You hear this mellow toot-toot-toot. It's a nice, gentle, soft sound. Long bills give a keek. When they flush, you'll hear a whole bunch of keeks. A bird's in a panic. And when we listen to the songs, we're going to listen to typical short bills, and then we're going to listen to long billed. And long bills in flocks, you'll often hear their song embedded. So you hear sort of a dee-dee-doo, dee-dee-doo. And I've heard that at all times of the year. It's the sound you typically hear on the breeding grounds quite a lot. And short bill and long bill give something like that. The difference between them is described in this paper, which will be in the references, Miller et al. 84, how the song differs. We have a song, so what you're going to hear first are short bills, then long bills, then that song element within long billed. And it's cool, and listen for it, and then you'll hear it in flocks of birds. And I always try to say, there's the song of long billed, and folks say, what? Point it out again. And of course, well, maybe 10 more minutes or an hour later before I hear it again. So let's, Frank, if you want to play that. We have the short bill. And now we're going to listen to long bill, the high-pitched keekery. Now, near the end, you heard that do-do-do-do, and now we're going to listen to that. Before we hit that, that was a number of birds flying, all keeking. So maybe you could hear, if you're desperate, you heard a toot-toot-toot, but the quality is totally different. And short bills, the difference is pretty striking. I think on my first Peterson recording of Dowitchers, you could hear the exciting twittering of the long-billed, and you could hear the kersplash of the rock. I think that whoever recorded it, his assistant, heaved the stone and then got them all to call in an excited twitter. Not very ethical, perhaps, but that was my interpretation of the sound of the splash. All right, let's listen to that song element again, which we were able to isolate, or I didn't, but Frank or Mark did. We're going to listen to that third recording now. There it is. Do-do-do-do, or however. Come up with your own mnemonic. And it's interesting, short bill is similar, with differences described there in the billet point by Miller. But I think if they diverged 4 million years ago, it's pretty interesting. The song element is quite similar between the two. And you hear it all the time where they're doing display flights over the places they nest. Again, I described the habitat for shortbill, those bogs, forested sphagnum moss bogs. Longbills tend to nest grassy marshes, more coastal and farther north. Next slide. Remember, short-bills are more quiet, but that doesn't mean you can claim a short-billed dowitcher if your bird didn't call. Next slide. These are the rules I have tried to teach since I was out of diapers. And every year I repeat the same rules. They should go up and be framed on the refrigerator. After I will not eat cake, you will learn the rules of dowitchers. A winter dowitcher away from a big estuary is a long-billed. A juvenile dowitcher in August is a short-billed. And on we go. I only wrote down 6 of them. You could work on 2 a day. Next slide. This is Jonathan Aldifer's illustration that I can't remember if, I think it was the 3rd edition of the field guide we redid the dowitchers. It was hard to, we show tails, we show the tertials, we show worn breeding with long-billed and fresh breeding. We show the 3 subspecies of short-billed, and of course the juveniles and the subtlety of the basic plumage birds. All our 2 dowitchers show a white stripe up the back, which the Asian dowitcher lacks. Next slide. So some last minute thoughts on in the big places, big estuaries where short-bills winter, some birds in a basic like plumage, short-bills summer. I think they're the second calendar year birds. Second calendar year means after the first, it, like horses, becomes a second year bird. Longbills seem to mostly molt into alternate plumage, and then you don't see them from late May to early July, and the few you do see seem to be sort of migrants and breeding plumage. Next slide. Now, this is this jumping Waldo at Crowley Lake. But as we look for the marks we discuss here, this is not a frozen moment in time that's then written into stone, and that's the way it will always be. We're always seeking new field marks, new aspects, steer clear of the jizz things, which annoy me. But Rob suggested that maybe there's a difference in the secondaries, perhaps paler on short-bill or a slightly different pattern. He's gotten that impression on winter birds, the few winter short-bills up at Humboldt Bay, that may be a character. So always be on the lookout for, and suggestions, come up with suggestions that we can field test field marks. So I throw out Rob's that he told me over the phone. Anyway, next. These are references. These will all be online. I would say, I've not read the Rowan paper, but he clearly had something important to say in describing his new subspecies of short-bill and arguing that there were 2 species of dowitchers. The BNA counts are useful. Todd's Birds of Labrador Peninsula has a fascinating paragraph after paragraph of the desperate search to find the nest of the griseus short-billed, which was found after the book was published. Wilds and Newland's paper in birding was very important in 1983, as was Aramillo, Pittaway, and Burke's paper in Birders Journal. And I think that's it. We'll look at the next. Again, Larry's been a big help on both the White Crown talk and this talk in supplying all of his pictures. Rob had good counsel. Daniel D. Gibson. Dan Gibson is always a wonderful authority on the history of the AOU and decisions and all of the supplements. He has them all in at arm's reach. He can tell me when a particular decision was reached. So Dan is always an encyclopedia of help. The staff here for this group has been incredibly supportive, and Without them, this talk would have been impossible. It takes a while to put together. Those of you still listening, I thank you. And be happy to start answering questions. That's a violet saberwing Q&A.
Yeah, actually, our first question came through. Someone doesn't know exactly what you mean by jizz. Can you explain that?
Gestalt.
Gestalt.
I would be happy if you could purge jizz from your vocabulary. But there's field guides written, birding by Gestalt or whatever the name is, which to me, it would be the last thing I would ever teach. But nevertheless, you look at certain references and it'll teach you this is a very good way to tell these dowitchers. So I didn't even bother to look up what the ways were because the shape changes from second to second, and I would just soon you forget all of those rules. So if you don't know what jizz birding is, you're well on the path to becoming a better birder.
And any other questions? Does anyone have? So if I was birding this morning on the LA River and I happen to see a couple of juveniles in there, I can just go ahead and assume that they were short-bills?
Correct.
Okay.
I believe my earliest juvenile longbill was in the Antelope Valley about August 27.
Okay.
But I had one as early as southern Idaho as the 21st of August. So, but we're not to the 21st. And again, the number I've seen in California, juvenile longbills in August is three or four. And there are piles of juvenile shortbills in through Labor Day weekend.
Mark, I believe the next question is for you.
Well, there's a question. There are a few questions in the chat also.
Okay.
One question is, do both dowitchers winter at Bolsa Chica?
Now, there's a good question. I would say yes. I know that plenty of, Rob Fowler tells me that there are lots of longbills that winter at Humboldt Bay. And I've seen in mid-November plenty of longbills and shortbills. They'll tend to often separate out. I think in the more marshy situations, you might have longbills, but I get to Bolsa Chica, but I don't live there. And I can tell you very carefully that here in November in the Owens Valley, there may be some longbills still around, but there are no shortbills. So my perspective on a day-to-day basis, I would rely on those who bird Bolsa Chica to tell you that. Certainly, there are plenty of wintering shortbills there on the mudflats, on the upper part of Bolsa Chica in particular.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have any comment on the barring on the flanks and undertail coverts in winter on either dowitcher?
I think in winter, looking at winter longbills, it's more of a wash of color. Not so much in the barring. I don't think there's a difference. And I tend to think that longbill shows fewer internal markings. So a dark wash of gray across the breast and down the sides and flanks, where shortbill tends to have is a little paler gray and the spots are more apparent, at least across the breast and the sides of the breast. I can't tell you specifically about the vent and the flanks.
Okay. Yeah, we have questions. So in September, both shortbill and longbills can be together and both molting. Is that true? Or have the short-billed juveniles finished molting?
Remember, when you go out birding, the first thing you have to decide with dowitchers, I need to know where I am.
Right.
And look at your watch. Maybe it shows the date. If you're at a place like Upper Newport, where short-bills will winter. Both adults and juveniles will be molting. So you got to remember, just if you're at San Diego Bay, if you're at Upper Newport Bay, if you're at Bolsa Chica, maybe the Point Mugu where you can't get in, Morro Bay, San Francisco Bay, those are all places that have short bills. If you're anywhere else and you have a molting bird, it's probably not a short bill. And long bills, anywhere where you are, a molting dowitcher could be a long bill, because the long bills molt, big inland marshes. They like a big marsh. If they're going to molt a lot of flight feathers, they don't want to be migrating. So a place like the Paiute Ponds or Medicine Lake Refuge in northeast Montana, there were thousands of long-billed dowitchers there because it's a reliable permanent marsh as opposed to a farm pond. If it dries up and it's lost a lot of its flight feathers, then what?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question about bringing up the slide with your rules. Frank, can you bring up the rules slide while we get on to the next question? We have a question on migration, John. Are dowitchers nocturnal or diurnal or?
Well, they're nocturnal, but you'll see shorebirds migrating during the day or before the dusk comes. Sadly, I mean, sometimes, late in the afternoon, you're chasing a rare shorebird and it gets up and migrates and it's all over.
It's all over, yeah.
Then you take tranquilizers to get you through the night.
Can you talk just a little bit more about bill length? You mentioned that there's some crossover.
Yes, it's long bills show strong sexual dimorphism in bill length. So and females have longer bills than males. So if you have a very long-billed bird, it's probably a female long-billed dowitcher. But all the other classes overlap. You can certainly get an idea if the bird appears extremely short-billed. I'd be curious. But making that judgment, I would never accept a record of rarity of a short bill by someone saying it has a short bill. But if they say, it had a bill unbelievably long, pretty good indication they had a female long bill.
Right. And someone asked about
tarsus length too. If you have the two species together, and I have slides, not in those days when you had slides, the short bills had shorter legs.
Someone asked about if they can get a copy of your rules, and I believe
let's put them on the website.
Right, exactly. They'll be on our website within the next day or two at labirders.org.
Yeah, we'll put them in the webinar page.
Under webinar. There's also a great, really good article on Dowitcher ID already on our website under Dowitchers, the Dowitcher webinar, if you haven't checked that out yet.
And the PowerPoint goes up, doesn't it? At some point?
We could, sure. And then you'll have the rules.
Yeah,
we hadn't talked about that.
We hadn't planned on that.
Promising something you don't do. But in any case, the rules ought to go up there. If you remember nothing else, remember the rules.
Absolutely.
And then also remember where you are. That gets to be, in a pandemic, that gets harder. You're probably at home. But if you're not at home, you need to know where you are. And you got to have some idea of generally what part of the month it is.
Exactly. For short-billed, what about geographic variations in the songs across North America?
That's an excellent question. And there's no described differences. That the basic winter plumage and the juvenile plumage is pretty similar with all the subspecies. Again, though, the tail color varies. Palest and Hendersoni, darker in griseus and caurinus, griseus especially. I tend to see on the tertials, on the juveniles and the greater secondary coverts, I tend to see more of an internal loop as opposed to the straight across tiger bars. Tiger bars may be more typical of Hendersoni and perhaps griseus, but I don't have any factual basis to say that, except I don't see the tiger bars too often here.
Right, right.
Maybe at all. It's something I'm trying to look for this year. Except I've been too busy on this that I haven't been out looking at short-billed dowitchers at Owens Lake.
But
Short-bills love the big sandy lakes with lots of shore to run around on. Farm ponds, less so, but they turn up there too.
And that kind of leads us to the next question. Can you talk a bit more about water depth and how they might be an ID clue?
The deeper the water, remember longbills have longer legs and longer bills to reach down. So if you get dowitchers well out into the water, it's a pretty good indication they're going to be longbills, but that doesn't mean a short bill that's going to feel lonely and vulnerable to predators. It may try to slip into the longbills. It's going to be a little deep water for it, but that's better than standing around on shore and waiting for the peregrine to pick it off.
And finally, it looks like we might be winding up. Is there an intermediate between caurinus and Hendersoni?
Well, just keep in mind, caurinus, in breeding plumage in particular, runs the gamut completely from griseus to, so many of them are intermediate. And that's the difficulty. We don't really know. I saw from one of the papers I looked at, there's a mention of a specimen of Hendersoni from San Diego, which I suppose I could ask Phil Unit was determined on measurements, smaller than caurinus. If you know the sex, maybe that could be determined. And also a specimen of Hendersoni for Arizona. And keep in mind that, so Hendersoni could occur, but we wouldn't know it. And I still, since there are no specimens that from Lake LaBarge or from the Denali Highway, we don't really know those are interior breeding caurinus or Hendersoni that have come over. And, you know, central, well, on the Denali Highway there, that's well west of here. North of Anchorage.
Yeah. Mark, I know there are a couple of other questions that popped up like in the chat.
Yeah, there are a few in the chat. Let's see. Well, there was one, I know what the answer is going to be, but this is a jizz thing about the angle of the bill in relation to the eye.
That's not jizz, that's specific.
Well, that's the question. The angle of the bill in relation to the eye, is that a good field mark? Well,
Mark knows the answer. But the first answer is I've not critically looked at it. And I don't mean to be sarcastic, but the bill is usually in front of the eye. In a fairly, there's some pictures. Larry's got one I didn't put in. That bill is flexible as it goes into the mud. It can sort of lift up and the tip gets a funny angle, you know, like you've just fractured your leg and the tibia is separated and sticking at a funny angle. And that's normal with dowitchers. So I can't, but I'm not going to give an answer on that. I haven't used it as field mark. Maybe there is some validity to it. I know that one description talks, it's a gestalt type thing that when you look at a long bill, it looks like it swallowed a tennis ball. Go to the LA River and see if you see any that have swallowed tennis balls and whether that's a helpful field mark. We've been discussions about the way the back angle is in relation to the head. I find that, you know, dowitchers, depending on the posture changes all the time.
Yeah. Are there any more questions? Pop it in the Q&A. And while we're waiting for any last questions, Jon, thank you very, very much for just a wonderful presentation.
Well, you're more than welcome. I'm missing a few, you know, the winter plumage of these dowitchers is something I could use better images of and more discussions. And, you know, there are questions of Hendersoni. Could it be occurring? There is a gap you have caurinus moving in the Western Great Basin like Dunlins. And then you get to the Eastern Great Basin, the Western Rocky Mountain states, and short-bill is very, very rare. Mm-hmm. And Dunlin, for instance, we see Pacificus Dunlin in the Western Great Basin all along the Pacific coast. And you don't get any Dunlins again till the Central Plains, but you're picking up another subspecies. What is it? Hudsonia or Hudsonicus and Hudsonia, I think. And that's, if you look at a gap in Canada, there's a whole part of Arctic Canada where Dunlins don't breed. And it's reflects what you're seeing in the lower 48, the same gap, Eastern Great Basin, Western Rocky Mountain states. So there's always things to learn. And dowitchers are, the breeding plumage is tough, but if you really think of all of the characters and think about worn breeding versus fresh breeding, you'll be well on the way. And to have a situation with one short bill with all those long bills, that was fantastic.
That's good shot. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, anyways, thank you again. We really, really appreciate it. And I think a lot of other people, we had at times over 90 people on the webinar, and I think everyone really appreciated it. So thank you.
Most people, Ron, most people have my email. I'm sure I forgot to cover some things or could have covered it better. I'm more than happy to answer questions. Surwide@earthlink.net and Dowitchers always fascinate me, and I always look at better ways to communicate. So if you're still confused and we're too hesitant to ask a question, just send them to me personally, and be always thrilled to carry on a discussion of dowitchers.
Absolutely. We also have on our website a contact page. If you forget John's email or are not sure about something, you can always submit a question through our website, and we'll be glad to forward it for you. And with that, next month, I believe we have Lance Benner on recording. A very, very important and hopefully entertaining subject. And with that, anything else, Mark?
I don't think so.
Thank you again, John. We really appreciate it.
Sure.
And we will see everyone next month. Take care.
Hey, Ron.